The first sound was not a scream. It was the silence after, a silence that felt unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. October 1872. Mississippi fog crawling low across the black fields, dew hanging like sweat on the wooden planks of abandoned shacks. And in that silence, the truth began, the kind of truth you were never supposed to hear. A family with no name, buried so deep in the Appalachian bloodlines that even their neighbors pretended they didn't exist. They lived in the spaces between records, in the blank margins of census books, in the shadows of churches that dared not say their name aloud. You could hear them only in whispers, muttered by old men in bars after too much whiskey, or by women who swore they saw pale children standing in the woods long after midnight. The first reports came from hunters. Their dogs refused to enter certain valleys, whining and snapping, eyes fixed on the tree line as if something ancient moved behind the leaves. A patch of land where the birds never sang, where deer trails ended abruptly at fences that weren't built by human hands. But the truth is this: the family was real, and their story was erased not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important, too disturbing, too dangerous to remain in the public mind. Whole sheriff's departments lost their records. Newspapers that once carried stories of missing children, missing travelers, missing lawmen, burned down in fires no one ever solved. And yet, fragments survive. Handwritten journals hidden in county archives. Eyewitness accounts that were buried in sealed court transcripts. One even found in the testimony of a Confederate deserter who swore in 1872 that he had stumbled on a settlement in Mississippi where the people did not eat like other men. He said their teeth were sharpened, their children were pale as ash, and their patriarch, a man named Ezekiel, always Ezekiel, stood in the doorway of a sagging farmhouse and told him plainly, "Some families pass down land, we pass down the hunger." This is the story you were never supposed to hear, the Appalachian family too terrifying to remember. The origins of that family cannot be traced through the neat lines of genealogies or church records, because they were never people of parchment and pen. Their history lived in whispers, in fireside warnings to children, in scars carried by men who swore they wandered too far into valleys where the sun seemed to die early. In 1872, Mississippi was still bleeding from the Civil War, still haunted by the smell of iron and smoke, still ruled by men who called themselves sheriffs, but acted like kings. It was a land where law was fragile, where murder could be covered with a shovel of dirt, where hunger drove families to sell daughters as wives and sons as labor. But this family, this brood, did not need hunger to drive them. Hunger was their inheritance. Ezekiel was said to have been born in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, raised in the old ways of the Hollow, before drifting south after the war with a small band of kin. They arrived in Mississippi like a plague that nobody admitted had spread. Their compound was not built but grown, added upon with each season like fungus on rotting wood. Cabins stitched together with rusted nails, pig pens that doubled as cages, smokehouses where meat hung, but no one dared ask from which animal it came. Strangers who passed by remembered the smell first, not the wood smoke of hickory, but the sharp, sweet odor of decay hidden under boiling herbs. And when the bold few stepped too close, when drifters knocked on the door of that compound asking for work, or when lost travelers begged for water, they did not return to the main roads. The pattern was always the same. Children went missing first, then deputies, then sheriffs, then entire search parties that ventured too far into the swampy woods where the compound sat like a spider in the middle of its web. County records, when you find them, will show families torn apart in those years. Farmers reporting their boys had gone to trade hogs and never returned, mothers claiming their daughters went to the river and never came back. Yet official cause was always written as lost, drowned, or wild animal attack. It was easier that way, easier for the community to turn its eyes than admit what they knew. For every man who lost a son, another man owed Ezekiel favors. For every mother who whispered suspicion, another was silenced with threats or strange gifts. Ezekiel was not poor. He traded whiskey and pelts. He delivered hogs by the dozen. He showed up with coin in years when no crop survived. That was how he bought silence. That was how a family of predators hid in plain sight. The first real killing that could not be hidden, the one that tore a hole in the fabric of silence, happened in the late autumn of 1872 when a farmhand named Jacob Turner was found in pieces along the edge of the swamp near the Ezekiel compound, though found is not the right word, because what was left of him was delivered like a message, placed carefully on the county road where wagons still rolled. The body was not torn by animal teeth, not scattered by scavengers, but carved, portioned, arranged in a way that suggested ritual more than murder. His hands were missing. His face was gone. The sheriff at the time, a man named William Rudd, filed the incident as a wild hog attack, though everyone who saw the body knew hogs did not sharpen bones to points or stack ribs in neat little piles. But Rudd was no fool. He had drunk Ezekiel's liquor during lean winters. He had taken bribes in coin and meat, and he knew that to say aloud what everyone suspected would mean crossing a family that did not fear law, church, or God. That was how the cover-up began, with one signature in black ink, a single lie written into the record books that turned a nightmare into animal predation. And yet the fear spread faster than the official lie. Men stopped hunting near the swamp. Families locked their doors when dusk fell, though locks meant little in a county where no one ever locked anything. Travelers reported seeing pale children standing on the roads, silent, watching, their clothes tattered, their eyes reflecting lantern light like animals. Some swore the children carried teeth on strings around their necks. Others said they moved in packs, speaking to each other in a language no outsider could recognize. And always, behind them, the figure of Ezekiel appeared, gaunt and angular, his filed teeth flashing in the lamplight like a warning. This was not murder for desperation. This was tradition, perfected. Ezekiel's family tree was a snarl, children born without clear parentage, daughters married to cousins, grandchildren with faces too alike to be explained by coincidence. Outsiders called it sickness, inbreeding, corruption of the blood, but those inside the compound called it something older, the passing down of hunger, the cultivation of flesh like any crop. Jacob Turner was not the first man to vanish, and he would not be the last, but his death marked a turning point. From that season onward, the entire county was complicit. They knew. And they chose silence, because silence kept them alive. The deeper you look into that season of silence, the clearer it becomes that the family's survival was not just about the killings, but about the psychological chains they wrapped around the community until fear itself became their most powerful weapon. Ezekiel understood men better than any preacher or politician. He knew that hunger and shame bend a spine faster than a whip. When crops failed, he delivered sacks of grain. When a storm ripped through the county, he offered lumber and nails, all stamped with the dark stain of his swamp timber. Men who took those gifts never spoke again of the strange cries they heard at night near the compound. Women who saw the pale children at the edge of their fields swallowed the memory like poison, because Ezekiel had a way of appearing the next day with a freshly slaughtered hog, as if he had overheard their fear through the walls. And so the silence became collective, a pact unspoken, a trade of lives for security. But there was more than fear at work. Over time, the county became dependent on him. His whiskey fueled the taverns, his meat filled their winter tables, his coin kept the sheriff's men loyal. And beneath it all was something darker, something no one admitted. Ezekiel fed not only his family, but certain men of influence who came quietly to his compound, men who were given portions wrapped in wax paper that they swore to carry home without opening. Those men were the true believers, the ones who looked the other way, not only out of fear, but because they had tasted what Ezekiel offered. The corruption spread like rot from the inside out, until the community itself became part of the hunting ritual. People whispered, but no one accused. Mothers cried, but no one demanded justice. Because to speak too loudly was to invite Ezekiel's children to your doorstep, standing in silence with sharpened teeth glinting in the dark. The family no longer needed to hide. The county hid for them. It was a system older than laws, older than churches, a system that every empire has used in its own way. Keep the masses fed, keep them afraid, and they will trade their conscience for survival. In 1872, Mississippi did not simply suffer a family of predators, it became their accomplice. Inside the compound, the killings were not crimes but celebrations, marked with rituals that blurred the line between survival and ceremony, and though no written records exist from the family itself, fragments of testimony and oral history describe nights when the air over the swamp glowed with torchlight and the sound of laughter drifted into the woods like smoke. The long table at the center of the main house was always set, not in the way of the poor, but in the way of those who eat together as a statement of power. Bowls of steaming stew, platters of roasted meat, bottles of whiskey lined like trophies, and every child present, no matter how young, was forced to eat, to watch, to understand that this was not food in the ordinary sense, but initiation. They were raised not just as witnesses, but as participants, taught that flesh was a legacy, a blood inheritance more binding than scripture. Survivors, the few who escaped the compound before being silenced, spoke of songs sung in dialects so old they seemed carved from the bones of the mountains themselves, melodies that lulled outsiders into a false sense of safety before the ambush began. The children's role was crucial, because innocence disarms the wary. Strangers would see them first, pale figures on the road, speaking softly, asking for help, and by the time the adults appeared, the trap was already closed. The rituals reinforced obedience, breaking down whatever spark of compassion might have survived in a child's mind. They ate beside their elders, their faces smeared with blood, their teeth sharpened by hand, each feast a binding oath that severed them from the outside world forever. This was how Ezekiel built not just a family, but an army, one generation after another molded into hunters who never questioned the work, who considered mercy weakness, who believed the outside world was prey, and they were a ozen. And just as the compound was fed with flesh, the silence of the county was fed with fear until the boundary between complicity and participation blurred. You must understand, this was never random brutality. It was discipline. It was inheritance. It was the cultivation of loyalty through ritualized horror, a pattern mirrored in every empire, every institution that demands blood sacrifice to preserve itself. The McCready family's table was not just a place of eating. It was a throne, and from it Ezekiel ruled a kingdom of shadows in the heart of Mississippi. The training of the children began almost as soon as they could walk, and it was training not of books or prayers, but of silence, shadows, and pursuit. Ezekiel understood that the future of his dominion lay not in his own teeth or hands, but in the next brood, the ones who could slip unnoticed into the woods, lure strangers, and strike without hesitation. At first the children were taken on hunts for animals, rabbits, raccoons, feral hogs, though even these hunts were twisted, for they were taught not merely to kill, but to stalk, to watch with patience, to study the habits of prey until anticipation became instinct. The older men of the family drilled them like soldiers, punishing noise, rewarding stillness, binding their senses to the environment until they moved with the forest itself. Soon the hunts shifted, and the prey grew larger, stray dogs, livestock stolen from neighboring farms, cattle driven into the swamp where the children learned to encircle them, cutting off escape routes as a pack. But it never stopped with animals. By the time a boy or girl reached 12, their first true hunt was always human. Sometimes it was a drifter who wandered too close. Sometimes a runaway servant who thought the swamp would shield him. Sometimes even a desperate woman seeking shelter. The child was sent first to follow, to approach, to speak. The family watched from the shadows, grading every gesture, every pause, every failure to conceal hesitation. Those who succeeded were rewarded at the feast. Those who faltered were forced to eat last, their shame carved into them like scars. And so the children grew into hunters who never questioned the morality of what they did, because morality was never given to them. Their world was the compound, their scripture the hunger, their purpose the kill. They moved in packs through the night, singing lullabies in that ancient mountain dial. Shat. Voices weaving a spell that carried through the trees and made outsiders drowsy, vulnerable, easier to lead astray. Even the law would later record the eerie power of those harmonies, men hardened by war admitting that the sound of children's voices nearly unstrung them. These were not children in any sense the outside world would recognize. They were predators born of ritual, conditioned through fear and reward, molded into hunters sharper than any blade. And when they looked at you with those pale, unblinking eyes, you did not see youth. You saw the echo of something older than civilization, something cultivated for generations, like a crop of hunger in the dark soil of the Appalachians. When the children's training sharpened into instinct, the county began to feel their reach, for neighbors were the first to vanish in ways that could not be written off as chance. A farmer's boy who went to gather firewood never returned, though his hat was later found hung neatly on a fence post as if placed there by unseen hands. A midwife summoned to a birth on the far side of the swamp was last seen crossing the ridge at dusk, her lantern swinging, her footsteps fading into silence. Weeks later, her shoes appeared at the edge of the creek, polished clean, with no trace of the body they once carried. Families whispered of shadows at their windows, of small footprints in the mud beneath porches, of laughter carried on the wind at midnight. But when complaints reached the sheriff, when men begged for protection or demanded justice, the files vanished, the witnesses recanted, and every report dissolved into rumor. Ezekiel had cultivated not only fear, but allies, sheriff's deputies who owed him drink, merchants who owed him coin, preachers who had accepted his donations when the church roof began to leak. And so the disappearances became part of the air, tragedies smothered before they grew into accusations, until even grieving mothers learned to silence themselves lest they find their own door marked by chalk symbols that faded in the rain, but not in memory. The children became whispers, the pale watchers of the woods, their hunts concealed under the community's own willful blindness. But the evidence lingered for those who dared to see. Livestock carcasses arranged in unnatural patterns, campsites abandoned with no sign of struggle but the soft humming of lullabies echoing through the trees, dogs too terrified to cross the property line though no man dared ask why. It was not poverty, not madness, but a system as structured as any army, as calculated as any empires, or machine. The family did not simply kill, they practiced, they perfected, they tested their methods on neighbors and strangers alike, refining a legacy of predation that no one dared name. And so an entire county began to live in two worlds, the daylight world of plows, sermons, and markets, and the night world where Ezekiel's brood reigned, where silence was currency, where fear was law. In that darkness, neighbors vanished, not just from roads and rivers, but from memory itself, as if speaking their names would summon the pale children back to claim another. The sheriff's corruption was not the clumsy greed of a backwoods lawman, but the deliberate submission of a man who understood that power could be borrowed from shadows as well as sunlight. Sheriff Rudd had worn the badge for a decade, a Civil War veteran who knew how easily men vanished when no one asked questions, and when Ezekiel came bearing whiskey during the lean winters, when he delivered hogs to feed deputies' families, when he placed envelopes of cash into trembling hands, Rudd did not see a criminal. He saw a partner in survival. Soon, The sheriff's department itself became an extension of the compound's silence. Arrest records disappeared. Witness statements were rewritten. Hunters who reported strange sightings were threatened with charges of trespassing. Even coroners' reports were altered, strokes of a pen transforming human predation into hog attacks, drownings, or the vague phrase, death by misadventure. And in this way, the law became an accomplice, wearing the mask of order while shielding something older and darker than law itself. Deputies learned quickly that those who pushed too far were reassigned or retired in disgrace, their warnings dismissed as drunken fantasies. One man, Deputy Collins, tried to speak openly in 1874, claiming that the missing midwife's bones had been hidden in the swamp. Weeks later, his cabin caught fire with his family inside, the blaze written off as an accident from a tipped lantern. After that, no deputy spoke again. But the silence was not only enforced by fear, it was purchased with blood, for Rudd himself is said to have dined at the compound, taking part in feasts that outsiders would never believe, his badge resting on the table beside sharpened knives. That was how deep the corruption reached. The man sworn to protect the county became a guest at the table where its children were devoured. From that moment, the compound was untouchable, shielded not just by woods and swamps, but by the very institution meant to defend the people. Every complaint dissolved into smoke, every investigation strangled in its crib. And so the family flourished under the law's protection, their hunts bolder, their rituals louder, their dominion stretching outward like roots beneath the soil. This is how darkness sustains itself, not through brute strength alone, but through the quiet surrender of men who should have stood against it, men who found it easier to bend, to feed, to look away. And by the time the county understood that its sheriff no longer served them, but something far older and hungrier, it was too late to resist. By the mid-1870s, the disappearances no longer confined themselves to one county, for hunger does not respect borders, and Ezekiel's brood had grown bold enough to cast their net wider, their pale children slipping through back roads and forest trails into neighboring lands where no one yet knew to fear them. Travelers along the Natchez Trace vanished without a trace, their wagons found intact, horses grazing quietly nearby, but no bodies ever recovered. Families moving westward in search of new homesteads reported strange encounters on the road. Children emerging from the trees at dusk, barefoot, clothes in tatters, asking for help in voices too calm, too rehearsed. And then by morning the camp would be silent, fires smoldering unattended, possessions untouched, the people gone. In Clay County, a preacher's entire family disappeared after a Sunday service, their house found empty, but with the supper table set, plates steaming as if abandoned mid-bite. The sheriff there wrote it off as an accident of bandits. But his report was so vague it read more like surrender than explanation. The pattern spread like a disease, and still no one dared to connect the dots. But men who worked the rivers knew. Ferrymen whispered of shadows on the banks, of voices carried across the water, lullabies that made them drowsy as if sleep itself were reaching for them. Hunters who crossed into unfamiliar valleys swore they felt watched, their kills left untouched as though claimed by something greater than them. Even in towns, fear seeped in, for strangers passing through were warned to travel only by daylight, to never stop near the swamps, to never answer the voices of children after dark. The legend of the pale brood spread faster than official records, carried in whispers from tavern to tavern, from farm to farm, until the very mention of Ezekiel's name made men lower their voices. And each new county that suffered vanishings followed the same script. Officials dismissed it as wild animal attacks, preachers told their flocks to pray harder, and families buried their grief in silence. The McCready brood thrived because their crimes were always too scattered, too hidden, too terrifying for anyone to name aloud, and in that silence their reach expanded. What began as a compound in one swamp became a network of terror stretching across the Appalachian South, a shadow kingdom where no law penetrated, no sermon could sanctify, and no family was safe from the hunger that moved in the night. By the time the 1870s drew to a close, the family was no longer just a local curse. They had become a regional phantom, a sickness whispered about in secret but never written, a nightmare that stretched its roots into counties that dared not even admit they were haunted. Among the many vanishings that spread across the region, one case in particular revealed just how far Ezekiel's reach had grown, and it was the disappearance of the Carter family in the summer of 1877 that forced whispers into something close to open terror. The Carters were not drifters, not outcasts, but respected settlers, church-going, land-owning, with ties to merchants and county officials, people too rooted to be dismissed as wanderers who had simply lost their way. They were last seen traveling by wagon from Monroe County to visit kin in Lowndes, a route well worn and considered safe, yet days later the wagon was found intact on the roadside, oxen still tethered, supplies untouched, baby clothes folded neatly on the seat as though placed there by a careful hand. But of the Carters, father, mother, 3 children, not a trace was found. The sheriff convened a search. Deputies combed the woods, and for the first time neighboring counties joined in. For this was no ordinary loss. This was a family known to many, their absence impossible to ignore. What searchers found, however, only deepened the dread. In a clearing near the swamp's edge, they discovered children's footprints circling the campfire ash, small and bare, their patterns deliberate, as though a game had been played there. Around the circle were crude dolls made of twigs and twine, their heads bound with strips of cloth that later proved to match garments worn by Mrs. Carter. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just the impression of ritual, of something rehearsed. The report was quickly buried, altered to speak of possible banditry, and though the Carters were mourned publicly in church, privately men began to speak of the pale brood, of the swamp family whose children lured good folk to their table. For the first time, the silence cracked. People began to admit what they feared, though never in writing, neither, or before officials. The Carter case marked a turning point, for it showed that wealth and respectability could not shield anyone, that the family's hunger recognized no boundaries of class or kin. From that summer on, travel routes shifted, settlements shrank back from the swamp, and even in daylight a sense of watching eyes lingered in every rustling branch. It was then that the McCready brood ceased being a whispered rumor of strangers gone astray, and became a name that respectable men feared to say aloud, for to speak it was to tempt disappearance, to invite the same fate as the Carters, swallowed whole by a family who feasted on silence as much as on flesh. After the Carters vanished, folklore rose to fill the silence that law and church refused to break, and in the absence of truth the county clothed its terror in stories, weaving myth around the McCready brood until they became less a family and more a curse that walked on 2 legs. Old women warned children never to wander into the woods at dusk, lest the pale singers lead them astray with lullabies sweeter than a mother's own voice. Farmers whispered of seeing lantern lights bobbing in the swamp, only to realize there was no path, no road, just water and mist, and those who followed the glow were never seen again. Hunters swore that sometimes the deer carcasses they gutted were found the next morning, rearranged in patterns too deliberate, bones stacked in spirals, hides nailed to trees like warnings written in flesh. A tale spread of a black dog with glowing eyes that prowled the swamp's edge, said to be the spirit of a murdered deputy trying to lead the righteous away from danger. Others said the dog was no spirit at all, but one of Ezekiel's own beasts, trained to track the scent of fear. The lullabies became central to the legend, songs that carried on the wind and seeped into dreams, said to have power to draw the soul from the body if listened to too long, and mothers began covering their children's ears at night, murmuring prayers while the faint strains of music drifted over the hills. Some claimed the brood were no longer human at all, that by consuming flesh They had crossed into something older, something the Bible never named, but the mountains remembered. A tribe born of the earth's hunger rather than God's hand. Others swore Ezekiel had struck a pact with devils during the war, trading his soul for dominion in the swamp, his children marked as living proof of the bargain. These stories spread faster than facts, for facts were strangled by corruption, while myths slipped freely through fields and towns, shaping how people spoke, how they feared, how they explained what they dared not confront directly. By the late 1870s, the McCready brood had become a legend as much as a reality, and perhaps that was Ezekiel's greatest shield. When horror becomes myth, it ceases to be prosecuted, and those who live in its shadow learn to endure it like weather. The folklore did not protect the people, but it gave them language to survive, and in that language the brood's power grew, for a curse feared is a curse sustained, and Ezekiel's name became not just a man's, but an omen. It was inevitable that whispers of the brood would spread beyond the ridges and hollows, and by the winter of 1878, the disappearances had drawn enough notice that outsiders were finally summoned. Men who did not belong to the counties or the congregations, men whose loyalty was not bent by fear or coin. The first were Pinkerton agents, hired quietly by a consortium of merchants and landowners who had grown weary of losing caravans and kin along the routes that threaded past the swamp. These were not naive men. They had chased train robbers, infiltrated unions, tracked killers across state lines, and they arrived with notebooks, rifles, and the hard-eyed confidence of professionals who believed no superstition could stand against discipline. Yet the swamp greeted them not with open defiance but with silence, and it was silence that unmade them. For weeks they found nothing, no bodies, no camps, only faint signs. Children's footprints too small and too numerous to belong to any settlement, scraps of fabric snagged on briars, animal bones arranged in shapes that seemed accidental until one realized they formed circles and spirals repeating over miles. At night they reported hearing voices, not the voices of grown men, but of children singing somewhere just beyond the tree line, their harmonies weaving so faint and steady that even the hardened detectives admitted their dreams were invaded. One agent wrote in his journal that he woke to find himself walking toward the sound, rifle in hand, boots sinking into mud, only to snap awake inches from the creek where another step would have swallowed him. The deeper they pressed, the less their training mattered. Maps failed, compasses spun, supplies dwindled, and each day their tempers frayed until suspicion turned inward. After a month, only one man stumbled back to town, delirious, his clothes shredded, his skin covered in shallow scratches as though clawed by dozens of small hands. He spoke of pale faces watching him from the trees, of voices whispering his name in the dark, and then he vanished from the county hospital before he could be questioned again. The Pinkerton office filed no official report. Merchants denied ever hiring them, and the episode was swallowed into rumor. Another half-remembered tale passed between farmhouses with the same dread as scripture. But in that failure, the legend of Ezekiel's brood only deepened, for if even the famed detectives of the nation could not pierce the swamp, what hope did ordinary men have? Thus, the family remained untouched, thriving in the shadows, their empire shielded not only by corruption, but by the futility of those who dared to look too closely and were consumed by what they found. The failure of the Pinkertons did not go unnoticed, for rumors of their disappearance traveled farther than the merchants who had secretly hired them intended, and by 1879 the matter had reached the ears of federal men in Washington who, though reluctant to meddle in rural affairs, understood that unchecked violence along trade routes threatened commerce itself. Yet the government's involvement came not as a public declaration, but as a whispering hand, sending a handful of surveyors and revenue agents under the guise of charting new land routes and enforcing tax collection. These men, dressed in plain coats rather than uniforms, carried not only ledgers but hidden pistols, their orders to observe quietly and, if possible, trace the pattern of vanishings to a human cause. But the swamp swallowed them as it had swallowed others. Townsfolk reported seeing them once or twice, asking questions in taverns, sketching maps in the courthouse, promising families that the law would finally take notice, and then, as though the earth itself had risen up to defend Ezekiel's brood, the men were gone. Weeks later, their horses were found tethered near the tree line, alive but gaunt, their saddlebags neatly emptied of all weapons and papers. What little evidence returned to Washington was incoherent. Scraps of notebooks filled with sketches of symbols, repeated phrases about singing in the trees, and one unfinished sentence, "They are not hiding, they are waiting," which trailed off mid-line as though the hand that wrote it had been pulled away. The government, unwilling to admit defeat, buried the incident under bureaucratic silence, filing it among 1,000 unsolved disappearances of the era. To the counties, however, the failure of outsiders was confirmation of what they already believed, that no law from beyond the ridges could touch the brood. The legend swelled in the absence of justice, and with each failure of authority, Ezekiel's family seemed less like men and more like an inevitability, a curse rooted too deep in the soil to be torn out. For the people who lived in the shadow of the swamp, hope in outside rescue evaporated, leaving only endurance, silence, and the whispered truth that no badge, no title, no government hand could shield them from the hunger that ruled their nights. Inside the compound, where the smoke of their fires never quite drifted high enough to betray them, the brood itself had begun to fracture, for even a family bound by hunger is not immune to the erosion of time. And by the early 1880s, Ezekiel's children were no longer the obedient extensions of his will, but men and women grown, their own offspring raised in a world where the rituals of blood and feast were treated not as revelations, but as suffocating inheritance. Some clung fiercely to the old ways, repeating the chants with a fanaticism that bordered on madness, convinced that abandoning even a single custom would draw down curses worse than starvation, while others, particularly those born after the war, who had never known a world beyond the compound, began to question whether endless secrecy was strength or a prison. Whispers grew among the younger ones who had crept to the edges of the swamp and glimpsed townsfolk from afar, their laughter, their dances, the sound of fiddles drifting on night air, a music different from the dirges their own kin sang, a life not ruled by silence and hunger. To Ezekiel, such doubts were dangerous infections, and he responded with the iron grip of a patriarch who would not allow dissent. He reinforced the feasts with greater cruelty, binding the family together with shared atrocities, forcing sons to carve alongside fathers, daughters to cradle victims as though they were infants, so that the weight of sin was shared, and thus no one could break away without carrying guilt too heavy to survive beyond the compound. Yet even fear could not completely smother the flicker of rebellion. Some of the brood began to hide food stolen from towns, corn, beans, dried meat, testing whether survival might exist without blood, while others, driven by curiosity more than conscience, lingered on the edges of settlements at night, watching children their own new age play, yearning for something nameless. These fractures did not yet explode into open defiance, but beneath the swamp's canopy, where kinship was meant to be absolute, the roots of division spread quietly, unseen, promising that one day the hunger binding them together might also be the wedge that tore them apart. It was inevitable that the strain within the brood would one day rupture, and the first crack came not with a shout of rebellion, but with the silence of a single disappearance from the family itself. For one of Ezekiel's grandsons, a boy no older than 15, called Caleb by some accounts, slipped away under the cover of night and never returned, leaving behind only his crude knife and a smear of bloodless handprints on the bark of a cypress tree, as though to mark his escape. Whether he fled into the wider world or was swallowed by the swamp itself, no one could say. But his absence was a wound that could not be hidden, and soon whispers passed through the compound like fever that one of their own had rejected the blood, that kin could become traitor. Ezekiel, furious, declared that Caleb's name be struck from memory, commanding his children and their children to erase him, as if he had never lived. But such erasures only fed the secret hope of others who dreamed of slipping into the darkness and finding a life beyond the rituals. Some said Caleb reached a nearby settlement and confessed what he had fled, his words dismissed as madness until strange vanishings followed in his wake. Others believed he was caught by his own blood before he could reach safety, his body displayed in secret as warning. Yet the very fact that none knew the truth gave birth to legend. In hushed tones around hearth fires, people spoke of a pale youth who came to their doors at dusk, gaunt but kind-eyed, asking for bread, leaving behind protection if fed or misfortune if turned away. Within the brood, his ghost became a shadow none dared name aloud, a reminder that blood ties could be broken, and that even in the heart of their darkness, a seed of rebellion might sprout. For the first time, Ezekiel's dominion was not complete, and though his punishments grew more brutal, the children learned to meet men, ask their doubts in silence, their hunger in ritual, while deep within themselves they nursed the thought that perhaps freedom lay just beyond the swamp, waiting for those bold or desperate enough to seize it. Caleb's vanishing bled outward into the hills and hollows with a speed that no sheriff's proclamation nor preacher's sermon could contain, for in every story told by firelight his figure changed and grew, becoming less a runaway boy and more a wandering spirit who walked the borderlands between the brood and the world of men, a reminder that even in the grip of horror there might be fracture and weakness. In some towns he was called the Pale Pilgrim, a spectral youth who appeared at crossroads with mud still clinging to his feet, warning travelers to turn back from the swamp. In others, he was remembered as the hungry son, cursed to forever roam in search of bread because he had spurned the flesh of his kin. Mothers frightened their children with tales that if they stole food, Caleb's hollow eyes would peer through the window and his thin hands would reach for them, while in other households, parents whispered gentler stories, that if you left a crust of cornbread on the sill at night, the boy's ghost would guard your home from the brood's shadows. Thus Caleb became both terror and talisman, woven into local superstition with the same thread as haints and witches, his name carved into charms and muttered in charms of protection, until in time he was less a boy than a symbol of rebellion against Ezekiel's dominion. And though the brood themselves never spoke his name aloud, they could not have been deaf to the way his legend flourished beyond the swamp, for stories have a way of seeping back into the ears of those they wound, and each whispered tale that painted Caleb as something other than cursed was, in truth, a blade pressed against Ezekiel's authority. Out in the counties, farmers and wanderers alike began to see the swamp not as an impenetrable wall of dread, but as a place with cracks, fissures where human choice might matter, and though no one dared test that belie, openly, the knowledge that even the brood could break was enough to plant a trembling kind of hope that perhaps their reign was not eternal. Inside the compound, Ezekiel felt the ghost of Caleb more keenly than any preacher or farmer beyond the swamp, for though he forbade the boy's name, its absence hung heavier than its memory, a silence that gnawed at the edges of his authority, and so he sought to strangle it with ritual. The feasts grew more grotesque, stretched out into nights that bled into mornings, as if by drowning his brood in blood he could wash away the seed of doubt Caleb had left behind. He forbade his kin from leaving the compound unaccompanied, posted watchmen even against their own brothers and sisters, and declared new rites of loyalty, in which each child, no matter their age, was made to carve their own mark into the flesh of the chosen sacrifice, a scar upon the victim's skin meant to bind the carver forever to the family. Some of the older children obeyed with glassy eyes, their humanity eroded into ritual obedience, but others flinched, faltered, their cuts shallow, hesitant, betraying that the sickness of doubt had already spread. To counter this, Ezekiel wove darker invocations into their ceremonies, drawing symbols in ash and blood across the compound walls, muttering words that even his eldest claimed not to understand, as though he sought to stitch his family to something older and less breakable than flesh. But beneath the chants, beneath the firelight, the fractures widened. Whispers of Caleb's escape slipped into the lullabies themselves, twisted lines murmured by children who were too young to remember him but too clever to ignore the void his erasure left. And though Ezekiel punished such heresies with lash and starvation, he could not unmake the truth that one had slipped free. His rage grew into paranoia, and soon he trusted no one, not even his own blood, sending spies among his children, turning sister against brother, brother against cousin, until the compound seethed with quiet resentment. The tighter he clenched his hand, the more the brood learned to move like shadows, masking rebellion with ritual, bowing their heads while their minds drifted beyond the swamp. In his attempt to erase Caleb, Ezekiel only carved him deeper into their hearts, not as a traitor, but as proof that freedom was possible. And though no one dared speak it aloud, every scar they were forced to leave on another body became, in secret, a tally of debts owed against their patriarch, debts that one day might demand to be paid in blood. The conspiracies began not with shouted oaths or blades drawn in secret, but with glances held too long across the firelight, with food quietly shared between cousins when Ezekiel's eyes were elsewhere, with the subtle exchange of words disguised as hymns during the long nights of chanting. Among the younger brood, especially those who had never known life outside the swamp, a silent recognition took root. That they were prisoners as much as predators, bound by rituals that served Ezekiel more than any god, and that if Caleb had found a path out, then perhaps another path still remained. They spoke of him not by name, for that was forbidden, but in signs and symbols. A hand tapped twice against the chest to mean freedom, a carved mark of 3 lines on a tree trunk to mean brother, small acts of communication hidden beneath the grind of their daily obedience. The conspiracies were fragile, born of desperation rather than strategy, but they carried within them the dangerous spark of unity. For if Ezekiel had always ruled by division, turning kin against kin, burying them in shared guilt, then even the faintest sense of trust between siblings was rebellion. At first, these gestures were little more than comfort, a way to endure lashings and forced feasts. But soon they grew bolder. Meat from raids was hidden instead of eaten. Knives were sharpened and concealed, and children slipped to the edge of the swamp, not to lure travelers, but to test how far they might walk before fear pulled them back. Ezekiel, sensing the shift though unable to name its source, tightened his grip with new punishments, but even his paranoia could not catch shadows moving in the dark, and so the brood's conspiracy deepened. It was not yet a plan, not yet a revolution, but it was the first quiet weaving of loyalty that looked away from the patriarch and toward one another, the fragile beginning of a brotherhood within the brood itself, waiting for the moment when silence might finally give way to fire. The first whispers of unrest within the brood did not stay buried in the swamp, for though Ezekiel believed his walls of silence unbreachable, fear has a way of seeping outward like smoke through cracks. And by the mid-1880s, travelers and traders along the back roads began to murmur that the family was weakening, that their unity had splintered, and their hunger no longer moved with the same precision that once made them unstoppable. Some said they had seen fires burning at strange hours, too many and too close together, as though factions within the compound were keeping separate vigils. Others swore they had found offerings, dried corn, carved bone, scraps of bread, left along the tree line, not the work of those who lured victims in, but of those reaching desperately outward, trying to communicate with the world beyond. Folklore bent quickly around these fragments, painting pictures of a cursed house devouring itself, of children rising in secret against their father, of a bloodline cracking under the weight of its own rituals. To the settlers, these rumors were both comfort and danger. Comfort in believing that the brood's power was not eternal. danger in realizing that desperation might make the family even more violent as it turned upon itself. Preachers seized the stories as parables, warning congregations that even the wicked could not withstand division, while others whispered that if one were brave enough to strike now, to press into the swamp with fire and shot, the brood might finally be undone. Yet no one dared, for memory of vanished men still lingered, and the swamp's shadows had not lessened their hunger. Instead, the legend of fracture became another layer in the county's folklore, a tale told to explain strange lights and missing livestock, a reassurance that though the brood still lingered, their reign would one day collapse under its own weight. And thou, Geach, the people did not know it. Every rumor of weakness that reached their ears was a reflection of truth, for inside the compound the conspiracies of the younger blood were ripening toward the moment when silence would no longer suffice, and the swamp itself seemed to shudder with the tension of a storm not yet broken. Inside the compound the storm at last began to break, not with a cry of defiance, but with the smallest act of refusal, a boy of no more than 12 who, when pressed to carve his mark into the flesh of a bound victim, let the knife fall to the dirt and stood trembling but unyielding before his grandfather's furious gaze. For a heartbeat, the circle of fire and kin held its breath, the silence deeper than any hymn, and then Ezekiel struck him down with a blow meant to terrify the others back into obedience. But instead, the act rippled outward like a spark in dry tinder. Cousins who had long whispered of Caleb shifted forward, some crying out, others snatching at tools and blades, their fear at last overcome by the unbearable weight of what they had been forced to endure. The compound erupted into chaos, screams, smoke, the smell of blood, not ritual, but fratricide, as kin turned against kin, some still loyal to Ezekiel, others driven by the desperate hope of freedom. The patriarch himself raged like a beast, his voice booming over the din, promising damnation to any who dared abandon him, his hands as quick with the knife as in his youth, but even his fury could not quell the sight of children striking at their own chains. Fires were set to the outer huts, whether by accident or design no one could tell, and the swamp filled with the sound of snapping timber and rushing feet as the younger brood fled into the night, some dragging their siblings, others running alone into the trees with nothing but stolen bread and the memory of Caleb to guide them. When dawn broke, the compound was not destroyed, but it was forever changed, its circle of obedience shattered, its patriarch bloodied though unbowed, and the swamp itself seemed to hold its breath, for the brood was no longer a single body bound in hunger, but a fractured family, half hiding in the wild with freedom burning into here chests, half clinging to the old rituals with fear sharpening their knives. And though the swamp had always concealed what happened within, this time the echoes of revolt carried outward, faint but undeniable, like the first distant thunder of a storm rolling toward the counties beyond. Those who fled the compound did not vanish into legend as Caleb had, for their numbers were too many, their desperation too loud to be wholly swallowed by the swamp, and within weeks, scattered figures began to appear at the fringes of settlements, gaunt and trembling, speaking in broken tongues of blood and fire, their bodies scarred with the ritual marks of their lineage. At first the townsfolk who encountered them thought they were haints or wild children raised by beasts, and some drove them away with stones and shot, unwilling to risk inviting the brood's curse into their homes. But others, moved by pity or curiosity, offered scraps of food and shelter, listening in horror as the refugees whispered fragments of their upbringing. Their testimonies were confused, layered with superstition and terror, but from their words the outlines of the brood's true nature began to emerge. Stories of feasts, where kin were bound and butchered, of chants older than the swamp itself, of a patriarch who ruled through hunger and fear. Preachers seized on the fugitives as proof of damnation incarnate, while lawmen debated whether these were victims or accomplices. Yet in either case, the fragile veil that had protected the brood for decades began to tear. The settlers' folklore, once vague tales of shadowy figures and disappearances, suddenly gained flesh and voice, and with it came a trembling sense of both fear and possibility. Fear that Ezekiel might come raging out of the swamp to reclaim what was lost, and possibility that perhaps his reign was not as untouchable as once believed. The fugitives themselves, though weak and half-mad, carried something far more dangerous than knives into the world beyond. They carried knowledge, and in the retelling of their suffering, they lit fires of suspicion and resolve across the counties, fires that would not be easily extinguished. Ezekiel could not abide the thought of his blood wandering free beyond his grasp, their tongues loosed to speak against him, their very presence unraveling the shroud of terror he had cultivated for decades. And so, with a fury that bordered on madness, he set his loyal kin to the task of hunting them down, sending small bands into the swamp's borderlands with orders to bring back the runaways alive if possible, but dead and silenced if not. These hunters moved like shadows, their faces painted in ash, carrying the stink of smoke and iron wherever they passed. And soon the counties awoke to new horrors. Barns burned in the night, livestock found gutted with ritual markings, families roused from sleep to find crude symbols smeared in blood across their doors. It was no longer the quiet vanishings of years past, but open menace, the brood striking not merely for hunger, but for vengeance, leaving behind signs that warned the settlers of Ezekiel's wrath. Yet for every fugitive captured and dragged screaming back into the swamp, 2 more seemed to slip farther away, their tails spreading faster than the patriarch's reach, and the balance that had once tilted so firmly in his favor now wavered. The settlers, shaken but not broken, began to speak in cautious tones of unity, of standing together against the brood's terror, for the fugitives had shown them that the family bled like any other, that they fought among themselves, that their dominion was not ordained, but enforced by fear. And though most still trembled at the thought of marching into the swamp, the first sparks of resistance glowed in their hearts, fueled by the knowledge that Ezekiel was no longer content to lurk unseen. He had declared war, and in so doing he had revealed his vulnerability. Within the compound, Ezekiel's rage curdled into something deeper and more dangerous than anger, a festering paranoia that hollowed his eyes and twisted his voice until even his most loyal kin trembled at the sound of it, for he no longer spoke only as patriarch, but as vessel for forces he claimed were older than the swamp itself. Night after night he stood before the fire pit, his arms streaked with soot and blood, chanting words that scraped like stones in the throats of those forced to echo them, inscribing sigils across the compound walls that seemed to writhe in the torchlight as though alive. He forbade sleep for more than a few hours at a time, insisting that vigilance alone would keep the betrayers at bay, and he stalked through the huts at all hours, dragging children from their beds to interrogate them, demanding confessions of disloyalty, seeing treachery in every hesitation and rebellion in every glance. The rituals turned darker. Animals bled out at the gates. Their entrails spread in patterns Ezekiel claimed would ward against the fugitives' corruption, while his sermons grew feverish, declaring that his own blood had been poisoned by weakness, and that only through greater sacrifice could their bond be reforged. Some whispered that he no longer ate with the family, but disappeared into the swamp alone, returning with his clothes soaked and his lips stained, as though feeding on something too foul to be named. Those who remained loyal followed him with hollow-eyed devotion, convinced that the patriarch communed with powers vast enough to restore their dominion, but others, broken by lashings and starvation, saw only a man unraveling, consumed by shadows of his own making. The compound, once bound in fearful unity, had become a place of muttered prayers and stifled sobs, a cauldron of suspicion where every glance might be a betrayal, every silence an accusation. And though Ezekiel clung to his rights with iron grip, each word he bellowed into the smoke carried the faint tremor of a man who knew his throne of blood was rotting beneath him. Beyond the swamp, the fugitives struggled to carve lives from the ruins of their past, scattered across farms, churchyards, and shanties at the edge of towns where suspicion hung as heavy as the swamp fog they had fled. For though some settlers offered bread and shelter, most regarded them with wary eyes. unable to decide whether these broken children were victims or vipers in disguise. Their bodies bore the scars of ritual, their tongues slipped into chants when fevered or dreaming, and more than once a preacher who had taken in a runaway awoke to find strange symbols scrawled across his walls in ash, drawn unconsciously in the night by trembling hands that could not yet forget the old ways. Yet for all their strangeness, the fugitives carried with them something that stirred unease into courage: knowledge of the brood's weaknesses, the rituals that bound them, the patterns of their raids, the rifts growing within the compound. Slowly, cautiously, they began to gather, first in secret meetings behind barns or in the corners of taverns, speaking only in whispers, then in more deliberate councils where sympathetic settlers sat among them, listening as the stories of blood and fire wove into a map of the brood's undoing. It was not unity, not yet, for old fears ran deep, and many still doubted whether to trust those who had once been the very instruments of terror. But the idea of resistance no longer seemed a fantasy muttered in church pews. The fugitives, fragile and fractured though they were, became living proof that the brood could be broken, and their presence forced the counties to reckon with the question long buried in silence: whether to keep trembling in the shadow of the swamp, or to march against it with fire and iron, ending at last the reign of the patriarch whose hunger had shaped their nightmares for a generation. In the counties the whispers hardened into resolve, and what had once been fearful gossip in taverns or murmured warnings in churchyards became deliberate preparation, quiet but unmistakable, as farmers, preachers, and weary lawmen began to set aside their rivalries and speak plainly of what must be done. Shot was counted and stored, torches bundled in barrels, hounds trained to follow the musk of swamp water and smoke, and in barns lit only by lanterns, the fugitives drew rough maps in charcoal, marking where the brood's traps lay, where their fires burned brightest, where Ezekiel himself was most often seen standing before his blood-soaked altar. There was no single leader. Some argued for caution, fearing that open confrontation would draw down wrath on their families, while others urged haste before the fugitives were hunted back into silence. But beneath their divisions pulsed a shared recognition that the brood's dominion had weakened, that the swamp was no longer an unassailable wall of mystery, but a battlefield that could be entered and perhaps even conquered. The fugitives themselves were torn, some desperate to sever every tie to the horrors they had fled, others driven by a smoldering desire to see Ezekiel brought low with their own hands. Yet all understood that survival alone was not enough, for so long as the patriarch lived, his shadow would stretch across the counties. Children who had once trembled at campfire tales now overheard their fathers sharpening blades and speaking the brood's name aloud, no longer as an untouchable curse, but as an enemy to be faced. And in this shift something profound stirred, a sense that the swamp, which had for a generation been a place of silence and fear, might soon echo with gunfire, torches, and the cries of men determined to reclaim what had been stolen from them. And though the settlers still moved carefully, wary of pies and the brood's vengeful raids, the first fragile threads of unity were drawn tight, weaving a net that would, when cast, seek to drag Ezekiel's kingdom into the light. Back in the compound, Ezekiel felt the storm tightening around him, though no settler had yet set foot across the threshold of his domain, for the air itself carried an unease that gnawed at him, a tremor in the swamp's breath that told him his enemies had begun to speak his name, not in fear but in challenge, and in that recognition his paranoia deepened into obsession. He prowled the ruined huts like a caged beast, muttering scripture twisted into curses, his hands slick with blood from offerings that grew more frequent and more grotesque, until even his loyal kin could not distinguish whether the rituals were meant to summon protection or to terrify them into obedience. Nights became longer in the compound, fires burning until dawn as Ezekiel drew patterns in ash across the ground, insisting they were veils to keep intruders blind, and those who dared look upon them swore the shapes seemed to move when unobserved, as if something beneath the earth shifted restlessly at his call. His voice, once the iron chain that bound the brood, now cracked and wavered with fevered intensity, preaching of a covenant older than the swamp, a hunger that demanded more than blood. And he raved that the fugitives who had fled were not simply traitors, but living blasphemies whose betrayal had thinned the veil between worlds. Some followers clung to him still, their eyes glazed with terror and devotion, while others whispered in corners that the patriarch was no longer entirely a man, but a vessel hollowed by the rites he forced upon himself, a husk through which something vast and terrible peered. The compound stank of rot and smoke, its air thick with cries muffled in the night, and yet beneath the dread there was an unmistakable tension. For though Ezekiel called down shadows to shield his dominion, the swamp itself seemed restless, as if waiting to see whether it would rise to protect him or swallow him whole when the storm beyond finally broke. Among the brood that remained, fractures widened like cracks in ice beneath a heavy boot, for though many still bowed their heads when Ezekiel's voice thundered through the night, their obedience was poisoned by doubt, and in whispered corners they confessed to one another that the patriarch's rites no longer promised protection, but only courted ruin. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fearful that the next sacrifice demanded would not be a beast, but a babe. Young men who once followed Ezekiel with blind ferocity now traded uneasy glances, wondering whether they were guarding a leader or shackled to a madman. Some still defended him with the zeal of the fanatical, insisting that the swamp itself pulsed in rhythm with his chants, and that to doubt him was to invite damnation. But even these loyalists could not deny the growing unease that settled over the compound, a sense that the fires burned too hot, that the air shimmered with something unnatural, that Ezekiel's shadow stretched longer than flesh should cast. At night, when the patriarch stalked the marshes alone, those left behind argued in hushed tones, whether to flee as the fugitives had, to submit and pray for survival, or to rise against him before his madness devoured them all. The compound had become a place of divided hearts, and though no one dared yet raise a hand against Ezekiel, the silence that once marked their unity was broken, replaced by the rustle of secret doubts and the tremor of fear, not of the settlers waiting beyond the swamp, but of the patriarch himself, who seemed less a man with each passing day, and more the embodiment of the hunger that had ruled them for generations. At the swamp's edge, the settlers gathered at last, no longer scattered voices in taverns or murmured councils in barns, but a ragged militia bound by necessity, their numbers drawn from farms, church pews, and lonely cabins where silence had once been the only defense, and though they lacked the discipline of soldiers, their eyes burned with the hard resolve of men and women who had lived too long under a shadow they now meant to banish. Lantern light flickered across barrels of shot and bundles of pitch-soaked torches, across crude maps scrawled in dirt by fugitives whose hands shook as they traced the routes into the heart of the brood's domain. And though suspicion still lingered between settler and runaway, necessity held them together, for without the knowledge carried by those scarred survivors, the swamp would swallow them whole before a blade was raised. Some prayed aloud, voices quivering but steady, invoking deliverance against the darkness. Others sharpened blades in silence, their jaws clenched with the grim certainty that prayer alone would not suffice. Hounds strained at their leashes, already scenting the fetid water and the smoke that drifted faintly from deep within, and in the murmuring night it seemed as if the swamp itself was listening, its stillness thick, its air swollen with the weight of what was to come. Though fear gnawed at every heart, there was in their gathering a defiance stronger than dread, for they marched not only to avenge the stolen and the slain, but to shatter the myth of Ezekiel's untouchable dominion, to prove that even the oldest terror could be dragged screaming into the light. And when the first boot splashed into the mire, the hush that fell over the crowd was not of hesitation, but of a collective breath drawn tight, the moment before fire and iron were carried into the place where nightmares had ruled unchecked for a generation. Deeper into the swamp the militia pressed, their torches sputtering in the damp air, the light reflected in pools of stagnant water that seemed to stretch endlessly between twisted cypress roots, and with every step the silence thickened until even the hounds faltered, whining low as though they sensed the weight of unseen eyes upon them. The fugitives led with halting steps, their memories guiding them past half-sunken snares, and the crude markers carved into trees that warned of boundaries no outsider had ever crossed and lived to tell. Yet even they moved with dread, for the swamp had a way of shifting, of swallowing paths and conjuring new ones, as if it breathed and listened, reshaping itself at the patriarch's command. Strange signs began to appear in their path, bones lashed into lattices that dangled from branches, crude idols of mud and hair that dripped in the torchlight, and shallow graves disturbed as if by restless hands beneath the earth. And though the settlers muttered prayers and clutched their weapons tighter, still they pressed on, bound not by courage alone, but by the desperate knowledge that turning back would mean surrendering again to silence and fear. Then came the sounds, a distant wailing that rose and fell like wind through hollow reeds, though the air was still, a splash too heavy for fish, too near for comfort. The faint rhythm of chanting carried through the black trees, never close enough to pinpoint but always near enough to chill the marrow. The swamp, which had once been only a place of mud and water, now seemed alive with a malignant will, and the settlers knew that they had crossed from the familiar world into Ezekiel's dominion, where every shadow might conceal a watcher, and every root might hide a snare, and though they did not yet see the brood, the dread that closed around them was proof enough that the patriarch had felt their coming, and that their war had already begun. Within the compound, Ezekiel stood before the great fire pit, his body gaunt and streaked with filth, his eyes fever-bright as though reflecting flames that burned deeper than the wood at his feet, and he raised his arms high, bellowing words that had long since ceased to resemble human speech. Guttural cries that tore at his throat as the air around him thickened and warped. The brood gathered in a wide circle, some swaying with the rhythm of his chant, others shivering and clutching their children close, uncertain whether they watched their savior or their destroyer, for the patriarch's voice seemed to pull at the very marrow of their bones. The fire flared unnaturally, tongues of flame stretching upward like grasping hands, and within its heart shapes flickered, forms that might have been shadows or souls, writhing as though bound and begging release, while the smoke coiled low across the ground, seeping into the huts, into the lungs of those kneeling, until they coughed and gagged, yet dared not move. Ezekiel cried that the trespassers had entered the swamp, that their boots trampled sacred ground, and that only by blood could the veil be sealed against their intrusion, and as he spoke, he slashed his palms with a rusted blade, letting his blood drip into the flames, hissing and spitting as though feeding a hunger older than language. A murmur of horror rippled through the gathered kin as the fire roared higher, casting unnatural light that painted the compound in lurid hues, and for a moment the swamp itself seemed to answer, its trees groaning like great timbers, shifting under a storm. Some followers bowed prostrate, convinced they were witnessing a miracle of protection. Others stared wide-eyed, seeing in their patriarch not divine power, but the madness of a man offering his very flesh to something that should never be called. And when Ezekiel at last raised his hot endies slick with blood, and cried that the swamp itself would rise to crush the intruders, a silence fell so deep it seemed even the insects stilled, as though the land itself awaited his command. The militia trudged deeper into the mire, but as they did, the swamp itself seemed to twist against them, its familiar contours unraveling into something alien, for paths that the fugitives swore they remembered now looped back upon themselves, and landmarks that had been clear by daylight shifted in the torchlight as though the trees themselves had been uprooted and replanted in silence. The air grew heavy with a stench like rotting iron, and the water at their feet bubbled though no heat rose from it, sending oily ripples outward that never quite broke upon the shore, as if some unseen hand stirred just beneath the surface. A fog began to curl through the branches, dense and low, swallowing torches until men walked only a few paces from their neighbors yet could see no more than shadows, and within that fog came whispers, thin, curling voices that mimicked the tones of wives, children, dead brothers, each syllable coaxing the settlers to turn aside, to step off the path, to lay down their weapons and surrender to the swamp's embrace. More than one man faltered, staring wild-eyed into the murk as if he had seen a familiar face beckoning him forward, and it was only the sharp cries of the fugitives, their voices raw with terror, that wrenched the entranced back into the column before they vanished into the mist. The hounds whined and snapped at nothing, tails between their legs, refusing to follow, and when the first torch guttered out, leaving its bearer clutching only a stick of smoke, the company realized that what they faced was not merely the brood's cunning, but the swamp itself bent to Ezekiel's will, a living labyrinth raised against them, and though their courage held, each step forward felt less like a march to battle and more like a descent into some ancient and hostile dream from which there could be no waking. Through the shifting fog, the militia pressed until the first clash came sudden and vicious, for from the black water and twisted roots the brood descended with guttural cries, half-seen figures lunging from shadow to torchlight, their bodies smeared with ash and mud so thick they seemed more beast than man, their eyes gleaming with a fanatic light that made even the bravest falter. The first settler to fall went down with a scream cut short by the glint of a crude blade, and in an instant the swamp erupted into chaos. Muskets fired blind into the mist, torches whipped through the air, hounds leapt snarling only to be dragged into the dark with yelps that curdled the blood of their masters. The fugitives shouted warnings, naming ambush sites, dragging men back from pits hidden beneath reeds. But still the brood struck with uncanny precision, their movements guided not by sight but by some unearthly rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with the distant echo of Ezekiel's chants. Steel clashed against rusted iron, shot tore through branches and flesh alike, and the cries of the wounded bled into the swamp's heavy silence until the night itself seemed alive with agony. Yet even in the terror of that first onslaught, the militia did not break. Farmers swung axes with desperate strength, preachers raised pistols with shaking hands but steady aim, and mothers who had taken up arms for the first time drove blades into the shadows that threatened to drag them back into silence. Blood churned with mud beneath their boots, and though the brood's frenzy was terrible, the settlers' defiance struck true, for every ambusher slain was another crack in Ezekiel's veil, proof that his dominion could bleed and that his shadows could die. Still, when the fog closed in again and the cries of the brood faded into the trees, the militia knew they had survived only the beginning, and that the swamp, fed by their fear and their blood, had no intention of letting them pass untested. In the aftermath of the ambush, the militia staggered into a ragged clearing, torches hissing in the damp as they planted them in the mud, their light revealing the battered faces of men and women who had survived but not unscarred, for several lay groaning with wounds hastily bound in strips of cloth, and others stared wide-eyed into the dark as though expecting the shadows themselves to reach out and finish what the brood had begun. The fugitives moved among them with grim efficiency, whispering harsh instructions, reminding the settlers that hesitation was as deadly as any blade, while the preachers knelt over the dying and murmured prayers that sounded as much like last rites as blessings of strength. Blood stained the water where it pooled around their boots, a bitter reminder that this swamp demanded a price for every step taken, and yet none spoke of turning back. For though fear gnawed at their resolve, each survivor knew that retreat would only mean more nights of dread, more children lost to the silence beyond their cabins. Muskets were reloaded with trembling hands, torches reshaped from broken branches, blades sharpened even as they dripped red, and in the quiet that followed the skirmish, there was an unspoken oath shared between them, that whatever waited deeper within, they would drag it into the open or be swallowed whole in the attempt. Yet the swamp itself seemed to pulse with their exhaustion, the mist thickening as if savoring their weakness. And though no new attack came, every creak of branch and ripple of water felt like the breath of the brood waiting just beyond sight, ready to strike again once courage had thinned. In that clearing, the settlers learned their first bitter truth, that this was not a war of a single battle, but a trial of endurance, and that the swamp, guided by Ezekiel's hand, would grind them down piece by piece until only the strongest or the most desperate remained.